It was generally agreed afterwards that the ghost had shown deplorable taste in timing. If one must have an apparition gliding about the more monastic portions of an Oxford college, the proper hour is some decent interval after midnight, not a little before 9. O'clock on a Trinity evening, when the voices of undergraduates are still heard in the quad, and the dean has not yet fully composed his countenance for compline, by which phrase he understood Hall. The apparition in this instance consisted, with a regrettable lack of imagination, of the body of the senior tutor. Magdalene Court, standing a little apart from the more reputable ranges of St. Stephen's College, had begun life 3 centuries earlier as a minor religious foundation. It had preserved obstinately its cloister, a low, dim ambulatory surrounding a quadrangle of grass so jealously guarded that no foot was permitted to profane it save those of the college gardener and, on gaudy nights, of such fellows as had drunk themselves beyond the power of accurate perambulation. Here, between the damp stone walls and beneath the black timbers of the roof, men had paced for generations, meditating upon Aristotle, the 39 Articles, and the probability of obtaining a first. On this particular evening, Mr. Philip Fenton, scholar of the college and a man of excitable temperament, came hurrying along the cloister with an essay upon the metaphysical poets and the conceit of death clutched in his hand, and discovered that death, dispensing with conceit, had adopted the form of Dr. Jasper Haycraft. Haycraft lay half across the threshold of the Latin library, his head and shoulders within, the rest of him sprawling untidily upon the flags. His gown was rucked beneath him, his grey hair stark against the darker stone. One hand, rather surprisingly clean and well kept for a don notorious for ink stains, was flung out palm upwards as though making a particularly hopeless point in a faculty meeting. The other was doubled under his chest. His face, turned sideways, presented to Mr. Fenton the waxy profile of a man whose argument with the world had been abruptly and, it appeared, definitively concluded. Mr. Fenton made a noise inappropriate to a place which the statute still described as claustrum, and retreated with some speed, cannoning into an elderly gentleman who emerged at that instant from the passage leading to the hall. "Steady, my young sir," observed the elderly gentleman. "If that is the way you habitually assault the higher learning, I do not wonder that the examiners go in fear of their lives." "I beg your pardon," stammered Fenton. "There is someone, Dr. Haycraft, sir. I think he's dead." "In which case," said the stranger with mild interest, "he is, for once, entirely beyond the reach of the examiners." "Where is he?" Fenton, who recognized now that the elderly gentleman was not a fellow but a visitor, felt himself at an additional disadvantage. He led the way back along the cloister, feeling obscurely that it was indecorous to introduce an outsider to so intimate a catastrophe. The newcomer, a long, fair, thin man with a monocle, and the relaxed bearing of one to whom nothing disagreeable is ever entirely unfamiliar, followed without further comment. Arrived at the library door, he stepped delicately over the sprawled legs and bent, not too close, above the corpse. "Dear me," he remarked, "this is not the position in which a man usually chooses to die in a college library. They are more apt to be discovered respectfully perpendicular, clutching the Loeb classics." "Has anybody sent for a doctor?" I came straight away," faltered Fenton. "I didn't know what to do." "An attitude," said the stranger, "distinguished in youth and disastrous after 40. Never mind, we will remedy it. Is there a telephone in this cloistered paradise?" There was, and within 10 minutes Magdalene Court, which had seen reformations and revivals and the introduction of compulsory German, experienced something far more disturbing, the arrival of the police, accompanied, to the Dean's undisguised dismay, by Lord Peter Wimsey. "My dear Parker," said Wimsey affably, "if you will kindly restrain your minions from galloping up and down the cloister like a cavalry charge, I shall content myself with a few maidenly peeps and promise not to rearrange the evidence." Parker gave curt instructions to the constables, whose boots at once assumed an air of conscious guilt. Wimsey strolled along the cloister, hands in pockets, apparently more interested in the stonework than the corpse. "Who found him first?" Parker demanded of Hodges. "Young Mr. Fortescue there, sir," said the porter, jerking his chin towards the undergraduate. "Came tearing into the lodge, white as a surplice, and saying as how Dr. Blackwood was all over blood, begging your pardon, sir." Parker turned to Fortescue. "You were coming from where exactly?" "Hall staircase, sir," said the youth, swallowing. I was late for chapel. I meant to cut across by the cloister. Quicker, you know, and I saw him. I didn't touch anything. I just ran to Hodges." Whimsy, who had noiselessly reverted to the side of the body, looked up sharply. "You didn't touch him at all? Not even to see if he might conceivably be alive?" Fortescue coloured. "Well, No, my lord, it was fairly obvious he wasn't." "Quite," murmured Whimsy. "Death does on occasion make itself intelligible even to undergraduates. Still, the psychologist might find material in the omission." Parker frowned. "What time was this?" 8:20, sir. The bell had just finished." "And when did you last see Dr. Blackwood alive?" "Last night, after hall. There was a meeting of the Historical Society in his rooms. Broke up about 11, I think." "Who was present?" asked Whimsy, with the air of one inquiring after a musical programme. "Dr. Blackwood, of course, Mr. Dalrymple from New College, Miss Ashton from Lady Margaret Hall, Mr. Gervase, he's a fellow here, and myself." "A mixed grill of intellect," observed Whimsy. "You will give Parker here the precise times and topics of discussion presently. For the moment, let us not keep the good doctor lying about in the draught." Parker signalled to the men with the stretcher, who advanced. Whimsy forestalled them with a gesture. "Just a moment, if you please, Dr. Bidder. Blackwood appears to be clutching life, or at any rate, its more material concomitants, rather tenaciously." He bent, took a handkerchief from his pocket with exaggerated delicacy, and prized open the dead man's right hand. A small, old-fashioned key lay in the palm, iron, worn smooth by use, with an ornate bow in the form of a quatrefoil. "College, domestic, or ecclesiastical?" Whimsy mused aloud. "Pray accept this, Charles, as a little memento of our friend. I should advise keeping it with his personal effects. People grow remarkably possessive about keys when deceased." Parker pocketed it. "I'll have the bursar identify it. Hodges, when did you last see Dr. Blackwood?" "About 7:30, sir, crossing the quad towards chapel. He always went to morning prayer, regular as the clock he was." "Alone?" "Yes, sir. I didn't see nobody with him." "And he didn't ring for you to open any outer doors earlier?" asked Whimsy suddenly. Hodges blinked. "No, my lord. All doors is unlocked by 6:30. Regulations. Chapel at 7. Body discovered at 8:20, counted Whimsy. "Our murderer appears to have been a brisk worker, or a remarkably patient one. Did Blackwood usually return to his rooms between chapel and breakfast?" "Most mornings, my lord. Took his letters there. Then he'd go into hall about 8:15 Regular habits, as I said." "And this cloister," said Whimsy thoughtfully, letting his gaze travel along the dim arcade, "forms the shortest route from chapel to his staircase." "Yes, my lord, unless you go round by the quad, but that's longer." "And more conspicuous," added Whimsy. "Thank you, Hodges. The conveniences of piety and murder are oddly aligned." He turned to Parker. "If you're finished with the picturesque portion, Charles, may I suggest we proceed to the bursar and the senior common room? An academic institution is like an onion. To get at the heart of it, one must endure a good deal of weeping and several odours." Parker sighed. "Very well. Hodges, have the body taken to the infirmary, and see that no one leaves the college without my permission." Hodges nodded and shuffled off, already radiating the solemn satisfaction of a man to whom something has happened and who, moreover, is in a position to prevent other people doing anything about it. Whimsy fell into step beside Parker as they crossed the quad. The mist was thinning, revealing the honey-coloured stone with that deceptive tranquillity peculiar to Oxford, where centuries of calm facade have covered every conceivable variety of disorder. Charles, said Whimsy conversationally, did you notice anything odd about the doctor's shoes? Parker stared at him. Shoes? Precisely, you didn't. How disappointing. Never mind, we shall come back to them. People so rarely murder in bare feet, you know. The senior common room of St. Bartholomew's was doing its best to pretend that murder was a regrettable vulgarity happening in some other, less reputable institution. Coffee steamed, toast cooled, and a faint cloud of marmalade-scented stoicism hung over the assembled fellows. They rose, shuffled, or twitched as Parker entered with the air of lawful disturbance. Whimsy followed, hands in pockets, apparently absorbed in the architectural niceties of the ceiling. The master, a fragile wraith of a man with an unexpectedly resolute jaw, cleared his throat. I understand, Inspector, that the unthinkable has occurred. Unfortunately, sir, yes, said Parker. Dr. Blackwood is dead. It appears to be murder. A collective intake of breath was followed by the rustle of gowns and the clink of coffee cups hastily replaced upon saucers. Only one man, a tall, spare don with a nose like a hatchet, merely tightened his grip on the Times. Dr. Gervais, isn't it? Said Whimsy pleasantly, coming to rest beside him. We met at that conference on medieval diplomatic seals. You advanced the startling proposition that the papal curia sometimes lied. Gervais's thin lips twitched. Lord Peter, I suppose you will tell us that murder has a particularly piquant flavour in an academic setting. It does lend a certain scholastic interest to the proceedings, agreed Whimsy. Inspector Parker would like to know about last night's Historical Society meeting. Purely, you understand, in the interests of chronology rather than criticism. Parker began with the master, but the narrative soon settled into the more fruitful channel of Miss Margaret Ashton, a brisk, dark-eyed woman from Lady Margaret Hall, whose intelligence sat upon her like an armour of polished steel. We met at 8 in Dr. Blackwood's rooms, she said, her voice level, but not entirely steady. The subject was the authorship of the Chronicon de Malvernia. Blackwood had circulated a paper claiming to have identified the author conclusively. Some of us disagreed. Some of you disagreed with considerable vigour, Gervais interposed dryly. Blackwood accused Dalrymple of intellectual dishonesty. Dalrymple suggested Blackwood was fabricating evidence. Fortescue knocked over the ink. I observed the usual amenities of scholarly debate. And you, Miss Ashton? Asked Whimsy, toying with the handle of a coffee cup he had no intention of drinking from. Did you join the festivities? I observed, she replied, with a slight compression of the lips. Dr. Blackwood possessed certain habits of argument. I declined to provide tinder. At what time did the party break up? Parker asked. Shortly after 11, said Gervais. Blackwood had worked himself into one of his famous rages. He ordered us all out. Dalrymple left first, then Miss Ashton, then Fortescue. I was last. He was calmer by then, at least. He had stopped shouting. Was he alone when you left him? Parker persisted. As far as I am aware. He locked the oak after me. I heard the bolts slide. Gervais's eyes met Whimsy's with ironic weariness. We do still observe some traditions here, Lord Peter, even if we murder one another between evensong and breakfast. And this habit of locking himself in, said Whimsy, was it recent? Blackwood had become nervous, Miss Ashton admitted. He believed someone was interfering with his papers, misplacing notes, removing drafts. At first, we thought it academic paranoia. Lately, he seemed genuinely frightened. Frightened of whom? Parker asked. A silence spread across the table like fog. Finally, Fortescue spoke, his voice coming in hesitant bursts. He said the college had ghosts, not the traditional sheeted variety, intellectual ghosts, men whose work he appropriated. He thought they were coming back. Ghosts with a practical interest in paleography, murmured Whimsy. How enterprising. And did any of you share his apprehensions about his papers being disturbed? Gervase hesitated, almost imperceptibly. I did notice that some folios he had borrowed from the library were not where I expected them to be, but at St. Bartholomew's muddle is indistinguishable from malice. Parker resumed his steady, implacable questioning. Your own movements after leaving his rooms, Dr. Gervase? I went straight to my staircase. My scout can confirm I was in by 11:15. I corrected essays until 1. No one visited me. Miss Ashton? I returned to Lady Margaret Hall. The portress can tell you I came in at 11:45. It is in the book. Mr. Fortescue? The young man flushed. I walked along the river for a bit, sir. I couldn't sleep. Came back in by the side gate about midnight. Hodges saw me. Parker made a non-committal noise. Whimsy, however, had shifted his gaze to the far end of the room, where a small, elderly fellow with a face like an anxious rabbit had been trying unsuccessfully to blend into the bookcase. "And you, Bursar," said Whimsy gently, "but see, I believe we have a key question to put to you, quite literally." The Bursar started. "Key, Lord Peter?" "Yes," said Whimsy, drawing the iron key from his pocket and holding it up so that the morning light picked out the fresh scratches along its shaft, "to a gate which I understand has not opened in years. Would you be so kind as to tell us who exactly holds authority over locks in this college, and who has been oiling them in defiance of their respectable decrepitude?" The college chaplain, the Reverend Mr. Chillingworth, received them in the vestry with the air of a man who considered the Almighty responsible for everything, including the police. He was tall, angular, and possessed the kind of morbid earnestness that suggested a long acquaintance with sin in the abstract and a profound ignorance of it in practice. "You are inquiring about the bells, Inspector?" he said, folding his bony hands as though about to offer the case in prayer instead of evidence. "A lamentable oversight, I fear. I was delayed this morning and the verger is indisposed with bronchitis. There was no one to pull the ropes." "No automatic mechanism?" Parker asked. "Certainly not," replied Chillingworth with genuine horror. "St. Bartholomew's does not entrust the canonical hours to machinery. The bells have always been rung by hand. It is part of the college tradition." Whimsy, who had been examining the cassocks with anthropological curiosity, turned back. So the cloisters, which normally enjoy a quarter of an hour of pious clamour at 7:30, were this morning plunged in unaccustomed silence. "Yes, I regret it exceedingly. One does not like to think of the undergraduates starting their day without appropriate spiritual disturbance." "On the contrary," murmured Whimsy, "I imagine their gratitude will be profound. Still, the absence of bells is most instructive. Tell me, Reverend, are you in the habit of saying private prayers in the cloister before the service?" Chillingworth looked faintly scandalized by the suggestion that his religiosity might extend beyond the prescribed timetable. "Occasionally, Lord Peter, when I have matters of particular weight upon my conscience, but not this morning. I overslept." "How human of you," murmured Whimsy. "And the verger, where does he reside?" "In the cottage by the north gate, but I doubt he heard or saw anything. His cough keeps him confined. You might perhaps question the organ scholar. The boy is often early in chapel." The organ scholar, one Henry Smollett, was discovered at the instrument indulging in what sounded suspiciously like jazz filtered through the conscience of Bach. He sprang guiltily to his feet at the intrusion. "You were here before 8, I collect?" said Whimsy, leaning against a pew with apparent indolence. "Yes, my lord. I like to run through the voluntaries before morning prayer." "And this morning," Parker prompted, "you heard nothing unusual in the cloisters?" "Nothing, sir. But then—" Smollett hesitated. "The chapel door was closed. It makes a good deal of difference to the sound. When the door's ajar, you can hear everything in the quad. But with it shut, the stone keeps the sound in." Whimsy's eyes sharpened. "And was it shut when you arrived?" "Yes, my lord. I supposed the chaplain had already been and gone. Perhaps he'd left it that way." "A chapel whose bells were not rung and whose doors were closed," mused Whimsy. Most unecclesiastical. Thank you, Mr. Smollett. You have been most helpful. Back in the quadrangle, Parker glanced at his watch. Let us set this out clearly, Peter. Blackwood hosts his gathering, receives a disturbing note and an even more disturbing telephone call, sends his guests away at 11 and is then not seen alive again. His scout finds his door locked from the inside at 7, yet by 8:30 his body is in the cloister with his head broken like an eggshell. No one hears a thing because for once the bells are silent and the chapel doors are closed. Precisely, Charles. We have in fact an acoustic alibi. Whimsy paced slowly beneath the grey arches. Our murderer needed a window of silence and privacy in which to perform his unpleasant task. The absence of bells and the closed chapel door between 7 and 8 provide exactly that. But the locked door to Blackwood's rooms is an additional entertainment, interrupted Whimsy placidly. A locked room that ceased to contain its victim while remaining obstinately locked. I must really make the acquaintance of the bursar. Any man who controls both master keys and rusted gates will be worth listening to. As if summoned by the mere mention of his office, the bursar emerged from staircase B, a pinched-looking individual with the expression of one who suspects others of misusing the stationery. He regarded Whimsy and Parker with wary distaste. I trust, Inspector, he said, that this unpleasantness will not unduly interfere with the normal operations of the college. My dear sir, said Whimsy with dangerous mildness, murder is the most abnormal operation conceivable. Allow us, I beg, to interfere with it to our utmost capacity. I understand you are the guardian of certain keys. They found Fortescue in his rooms, seated at his desk with an open volume of Stubbs' Constitutional History before him and the expression of a man who had read the same paragraph 14 times without advancing his understanding. He sprang to his feet as Parker entered, his pallor suggesting that the morning's events had not sat well upon a nervous digestion. Mr. Fortescue, Parker began with official gravity, will need a detailed account of your movements between 6:30 and 8:30 this morning. Fortescue swallowed visibly. Of course, Inspector. Anything I can do to assist. Begin, Whimsy suggested pleasantly, with your ecclesiastical duties. I understand you have been lending a hand in the bell tower, a sort of undergraduate campanile auxiliary. The young man coloured faintly. Oh, that! Yes, I've been helping Trevelyan. He's not as spry as he was, and I offered to pull the ropes for morning prayer. But I didn't think it mattered this morning. The bells, they wouldn't ring. An admirable summary, said Whimsy. We should, however, like the director's cut rather than the trailer. Fortescue gripped the back of his chair as though it might otherwise desert him. I went to the bell tower at 6:45 as usual. I gave the rope a test pull, and it came away in my hands, snapped clean through. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. Panicked sufficiently, Parker observed, to abandon your post entirely without reporting the damage. I meant to report it, Fortescue protested. I went down thinking to find Trevelyan or the chaplain, but I saw Dr. Blackwood crossing the quad toward the cloisters. I thought he'd be furious about the bells, and I didn't want to be the one to tell him. I hesitated, and by the time I decided I must speak to the chaplain, I found him. In the cloister, Whimsy prompted gently, already beyond the reach of academic censure. The boy shuddered. He was lying there, face down. So much blood. I thought at first he'd slipped on the stone, but then I saw his head and... He broke off with a convulsive swallow. You touched nothing? Parker's tone sharpened. Only his wrist, Fortescue replied quickly, to see if he was, well, there was no pulse. Then I ran straight to Hodges in the porter's lodge, I swear it. Whimsy nodded, apparently satisfied for the moment. Tell me, Mr. Fortescue, were you aware last night that you had bell duty this morning? Of course, my lord. I always set my alarm. I didn't sleep much, though, not after that horrible historical society meeting. Horrible in what sense? Parker inquired. Fortescue hesitated. Dr. Blackwood was unusually vicious. He tore into Mr. Dalrymple's paper as though he meant to destroy him, not his argument. And when Miss Ashton dared contradict him on a dating of sources, he said something about women in scholarship that made her go white as paper. It was, ugly. Did you notice the note he received? Whimsy asked. Yes, Wilkins brought it in on a salver. The same heavy paper the college uses for official letters. Blackwood read it, crushed it in his fist and put it in his pocket. After that, he drank more port than usual and kept checking his watch. And the telephone call? I heard the bell, but I didn't listen. Blackwood went into his bedroom and shut the door. His voice carried, though, angry, strained. I caught, you wouldn't dare, and something like, I'll see you ruined first. When he came back, he looked dreadful. Did he mention who had called? Parker asked. No, Inspector, he just snapped that the meeting was over. When I lingered to ask about my essay, he told me to stop wasting his time and go and learn my declensions. It was rather unkind. Whimsy's gaze wandered thoughtfully about the room. You are fond of Dr. Blackwood, Mr. Fortescue? The boy's shoulders sagged. I admired him. He could be beastly, of course, but he was brilliant. I wouldn't hurt him. I couldn't. Yet, Whimsy remarked mildly, someone was concerned enough about time this morning to sabotage the bells that should have protected the murder, and then to contrive a death ind, a cloister where whispers carry from end to end, an odd combination of forethought and risk. Fortescue lifted his head, eyes wide. You think the bells were cut for the murder? But then, why would anyone kill him when they weren't ringing? That, Mr. Fortescue, said Whimsy, rising, is precisely the question that is beginning to interest me. That, and what became of the note on cream paper, and why Dr. T. Blackwood found it necessary to consult the bursar about insurance on the very evening he was destined to become such an expensive item of human wreckage. He moved toward the door, his hand already on the knob before he added, almost as an afterthought, one more point. When you left Blackwood's rooms last night, did you notice whether his bedroom door was locked or merely closed? Closed, my lord. Not locked, I remember, because I could see the line of light under it during that telephone call. Ah, murmured Whimsy. Light under doors, sound in cloisters, and bells that fail on cue. Our murderer appears to have an artistic appreciation of both acoustics and illumination. Thank you, Mr. Fortescue. Do try not to go far. I fancy the inspector may wish to speak with you again, at length. The Fellows' Garden of St. Bartholomew's lay beyond the college like a forgotten conviction, acknowledged in theory, seldom visited in practice. The rust-black iron gate that nominally secured it bore ornamental scrollwork of the late 18th century and a heavy padlock of more recent origin. Both, Whimsy noted with unholy satisfaction, displayed the particular fresh scoring of metal that suggested recent and determined attention. Hodges produced a large, self-important keyring whose clanking announced entirely the wrong sort of discretion. He selected a key with the care of a man drawing a winning lottery ticket, then paused as Whimsy produced the ornate iron key taken from Blackwood's hand. If you will forgive the professional discourtesy, Hodges, Whimsy murmured, I rather fancy our late historian had preempted your usual duties. The key slid into the old lock with the sensuous ease of long familiarity. Rusted solid, since the armistice, Hodges had said. The gate protested with a theatrical groan as Whimsy and Parker pushed it inward, granting them entry to a patch of carefully cultivated seclusion. The garden itself was a modest Eden of clipped lawns and overgrown yews, with a central stone sundial whose gnomon cast a precise shadow despite the lingering morning mist. A sense of deliberate privacy clung to the place. It was the sort of garden where awkward confessions and quiet ruinations might comfortably occur. Observe, Charles, said Whimsy, adopting the didactic tone that invariably made Parker suspicious. Our sundial appears to tell the correct time, yet the college clocks lag behind it by several minutes. One might almost suspect a campaign to obscure the exact chronology of certain nocturnal movements. Parker crouched by the path, tracing with his pencil the impression of recent footprints in the damp gravel. 2 sets, at least, he observed. One in heavy-soled boots, one lighter, perhaps ladies' shoes, both leading toward the south wall. They followed the trail to a section of ivy-draped masonry where the college's perimeter abutted a narrow lane beyond. Here the stones bore the telltale abrasion of repeatedly placed feet, and the ivy showed signs of recent disturbance. A brick had been loosened at about shoulder height, creating a convenient handhold. "An unorthodox postern gate," Whimsy remarked. "Very useful for those wishing to avoid the scrutiny of the porter's lodge." Parker peered over the wall into the lane beyond. "Easy enough to get in or out here without being seen from the quad. Our murderer needn't have been in college at all when the gates were locked." Whimsy's attention, however, had shifted to a stone bench, half concealed by yew branches. Upon it lay a small stack of papers held down by a paperweight in the shape of a medieval bishop, its mitre slightly dented. The top sheet bore Blackwood's spiky hand. "Codex Magdalensis final notes, to be opened only in the event of my death or public disgrace." "How charmingly cooperative of our victim," Whimsy murmured, lifting the papers with gloved fingers. "He appears to have anticipated one or the other contingency with some confidence." The pages yielded an unsavory tale. 2 decades earlier, during restoration work in the college library, Blackwood had discovered a suppressed medieval chronicle, Codex Magdalensis, containing allegations of heresy, embezzlement, and uncanonical indulgences by various pious worthies whose descendants presently sat on college governing bodies. Rather than publish his findings, Blackwood had quietly monetized them. "He'd turned scholarship into extortion," Parker said grimly, skimming a paragraph in which a certain G. as was admonished in veiled terms about family benefactions and endowments raised upon false pretense. Half the college must have been under his thumb. "Not only the college," Whimsy corrected, indicating a list of names accompanied by dates and amounts. "Here we have benefactors, clerics, at least one bishop, and a familiar one, Miss Margaret Ashton. Our lady medievalist appears to have had a forebear with interesting views on apostolic poverty and the communal ownership of certain rather valuable manuscripts." He turned the last page and discovered something more concrete than moral turpitude, a reference to the Magdalene treasure, relocated 1472 under West Cloister Arch, beneath. Prior's Stair. A rough sketch matched, with unpleasant exactitude, the area where Blackwood's body had been discovered. "Blackmail, buried treasure, and a conveniently placed corpse," Whimsy said lightly. "We are getting quite distressingly into the realm of the Gothic, Charles. Happily, the human motives remain reassuringly squalid." Parker folded his arms. So Blackwood had finally found something worth killing for. Or, Whimsy corrected, something worth killing to keep buried. "I think our next conversation must be with Miss Ashton. She appears to have more than a purely academic interest in medieval suppression." Gervais received them in his rooms with the brittle composure of a man who has rehearsed answers for one set of questions and suddenly perceives that an entirely different examination paper is about to be set. "Back again, Lord Peter?" he remarked, setting aside a tray on which the remains of luncheon consoled themselves with a decanter of college port. "I infer from your expression that you have discovered something more diverting than undergraduate gossip." "Undergraduate gossip, my dear Gervais, possesses its own austere charm," Whimsy replied, taking a chair without invitation. "But I confess I have lately developed an academic enthusiasm for medieval charters, spectral photography, and the interesting question of how far a fellowship may be stretched before it snaps." The younger man's colour drained with impressive rapidity. His fingers tightened fractionally on his wine-glass. "I don't understand what you mean." "Oh, come now," Whimsy said pleasantly. "You understand perfectly. Allow me to summarize your recent scholarly activities. You discovered, or perhaps created, a series of charters upon which your entire reputation now rests. Doctor. Blackwood, possessed of both technical skill and an unpleasant sense of mischief, has lately spent his evenings in a disused scriptorium subjecting your precious documents to photographic indignities. The results," he produced a drying photograph with theatrical casualness, "indicate that your medieval vellum bears 19th century ink, and that your watermarks are about as authentically 12th century as the Great Western Railway. Gervais stared at the photograph as though it were a venomous serpent. For a moment, the mask cracked. Fear and fury jostled nakedly beneath the surface. Blackwood had no right, he burst out. He knew what that discovery would mean. My work, my career, it would all be destroyed. He enjoyed the prospect. He was going to expose me at the next faculty board. He said he would tear the fraudulent structure down stone by stone before an appreciative audience. Parker's pencil scratched with satisfaction. You argued with him about this last night? Of course I argued. Any man would. But murder? Gervais managed a ghastly approximation of dignity. Murder is quite another matter. Yet you were observed in the vicinity of the supposedly locked Fellows' Garden Gate at 8 o'clock this morning, Whimsy remarked, turning the photograph between his fingers. Wearing leather gloves in a garden with no motor cars to justify them. One might almost suppose you had been handling certain rusted objects with criminal delicacy. Gervais swallowed. I went to look for Blackwood. He often walked there in the mornings. When I heard what had happened, panic, I suppose. I thought if he had hidden anything, any notes, photographs, I might find them there first. A laudable instinct for self-preservation, Whimsy observed dryly. And did you? The younger man's eyes flickered, a movement so slight that Parker might have missed it. But Whimsy, whose entire profession consisted of noticing such betrayals, did not. No, Gervais said, there was nothing. On the contrary, Whimsy murmured, there was rather a great deal. Enough to demonstrate that Blackwood had assembled a complete case against you. Enough, in fact, for any self-respecting jury to agree that you possessed both motive and opportunity to silence him permanently. Parker closed his notebook with a snap that sounded perilously like handcuffs in embryo. Arthur Gervais, I must ask you formally, where were you between 6:30 and 7:30 this morning? In my rooms? The answer came too quickly. Working? Alone? Parker's tone made the word sound like an indictment. Gervais hesitated, then seized on a fragile reed. Miss Ashton telephoned me at 6:50. We discussed some references she required. She will confirm it. Miss Ashton, Whimsy repeated mildly. Our diligent Lady Margaret Hall, scholar, how very obliging of her to provide you with an alibi, and at such an academically improbable hour. I think, Charles, that before we proceed to any premature conclusions, we should verify Miss Ashton's recollection of early morning bibliographical discussions. If she confirms Gervais's story, our neat little structure of motive and opportunity collapses in the most inconvenient fashion. He rose, the photograph still held delicately between thumb and forefinger. I dislike murderers who arrange their affairs too tidily. It suggests a certain lack of imagination. When the evidence points with indecent directness to one person, experience has taught me to suspect that someone else has been doing a little quiet pointing from the wings. Gervais made a harsh, incredulous sound. You think someone is framing me? Who in heaven's name would benefit from that? Whimsy's smile held very little mirth. Why, my dear Gervais, that is precisely what I propose to discover. And I have a suspicion that Miss Ashton's telephone call may prove rather more significant than even you imagine. The Historical Society convened that afternoon in the senior common room under considerably less scholarly auspices than usual. Miss Margaret Ashton from Lady Margaret Hall occupied a straight-backed chair with the self-conscious poise of a woman determined not to be relegated to decorative status among male intellects. Dalrymple of New College, whose theories on monastic land tenure had been so brutally dismembered by Blackwood the previous evening, slouched with truculent unease near the mantelpiece. My apologies, Whimsy began pleasantly, taking up a position by the window where the light fell advantageously upon his features, for converting your learned society into a kind of academic assize. However, murder appears to have crept into your bibliographies, and one must acknowledge original research when one sees it. Miss Ashton regarded him levelly. If this is to be an inquisition, Lord Peter, I shall require tea. I find institutional China greatly fortifies the spirit in moments of professional crisis. Whimsy signalled to Hodges, who hovered with the tea tray already prepared, a detail which did not escape his notice. The salver bore faint scratches along one edge, as though it had recently scraped against stone. A trivial observation, but Whimsy filed it away with characteristic tidiness. "Let us begin," said Parker, "with last night. Dr. Blackwood hosts your meeting, receives a note on college paper at 10 o'clock, takes a private telephone call at 10:20, and dismisses you all by 11. This morning he's discovered in the East Cloister with his skull broken and a key to the Fellows' Garden in his hand. We require your precise movements, and we require them without creative embellishment." Dalrymple cleared his throat with the air of a man preparing for cross-examination rather than conversation. "I left Blackwood's rooms at exactly 11:08. I know because the chapel clock struck the quarter as I passed under the arch. I returned directly to New College and can produce my porter to swear to my arrival." 11:08, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. "Curious, since the chapel clock was discovered stopped this morning at 6:30. It has been running fast for days, according to the bursar. Fascinating, the elasticity of time in academic institutions." Miss Ashton took her tea without sugar. "I left a few minutes after Mr. Dalrymple," she said calmly. "Walked back to Lady Margaret Hall alone, by the river path. I encountered no one. I can offer no alibi beyond the fact that I am unlikely to have overpowered a grown man in a cloister and bludgeoned him to death without so much as disturbing my coiffure." "On the contrary, Miss Ashton," Whimsy replied mildly, "I should say you possess precisely the sort of disciplined temperament required for decisive action, particularly after Blackwood's dismissal of your paper on female monastic economies as sentimental embroidery." A brief silence followed this remark. Miss Ashton regarded him coolly. If every young woman whose work has been patronized by an older male colleague resorted to murder Lord Peter, the cloisters of Oxford would resemble an abattoir. "Quite," Whimsy agreed cheerfully. "Nevertheless, Blackwood's capacity to inspire murderous resentment appears to have been almost universal. What interests me is not who disliked him, that would be a question of population statistics, but who understood the precise configuration of bells, clocks, and doors that would make his death appear both impossible and conveniently explicable." He turned his attention to the telephone on the side table, a solid black instrument whose presence in an ancient college seemed faintly indecent. "Tell me, Hodges, from which exchange does this line operate?" "The main college switchboard, my lord. All calls after 9 must go through the porter's lodge. I connect them myself." "And last night?" Whimsy inquired. "The call Dr. Blackwood received at 10:20. Hodges shifted uneasily. "Came from within the college, my lord. From the senior bursary. But Dr. Symes swears he made no such call." "An internal call that no one owns," Whimsy murmured with satisfaction. "So we have forged letters, manipulated bells, and now phantom telephone conversations. Someone is composing a remarkably elaborate fugue in deceit." Miss Ashton set down her cup with deliberate care. "If you are suggesting that one of us orchestrated this little symphony, Lord Peter, you will need more than suggestive metaphors. You will need proof." "Oh, I quite agree," Whimsy said pleasantly, "and I intend to obtain it. But proof is a matter of chronology and opportunity, Miss Ashton. Someone here possesses an exceptionally tidy mind. They have arranged their evidence with the same precision one might employ in ordering a bibliography. Cross-referenced, misleading, and subtly incomplete." He rose, the light catching his monocle at a dangerously cheerful angle. "What intrigues me is a detail so minor that none of you has bothered to mention it. The matter of the window in Blackwood's bedroom. It was found slightly open this morning, despite the night's chill. I think, Charles, that when we discover who opened that window and why, we may find ourselves significantly closer to our murderer." They returned to the scriptorium at dusk when the Fellows' Garden assumed that faintly sepulchral quality which Oxford stone wears so well in the half-light. The yews closed in with conspiratorial intimacy, and the disused building itself presented the aspect of a minor chantry awaiting fresh interments. Whimsy seemed in excellent spirits. "Observe, Charles," he remarked as they approached, "how murder, like medieval theology, benefits from proper staging. The scenery here is really quite cooperative." Inside, the chamber remained as they had left it, save for a single, almost imperceptible alteration. One of the heavy blackout curtains had been drawn aside by roughly half an inch, admitting a thin blade of evening light across the stone floor. Whimsy bent at once, examining the disturbed dust with the enthusiasm of a man discovering a rare incunable. "Recent footprint," he murmured. "Size 5, I should say. Feminine. Our Miss Ashton has been continuing her extracurricular research." Parker glanced around the room with professional unease. "If you seriously intend to stage some sort of ambush here, Peter, I should prefer to know in advance whom we're expecting to catch." "Oh, but that would spoil the experiment," Whimsy replied cheerfully, moving to the photographic table. "You see, we have constructed a problem in applied psychology. Someone in this college believes they have successfully manipulated time, space, and human frailty to produce a convenient murder. The question is, how will they react when the balance of power shifts?" He lit a single candle and placed it beside the trays, then carefully arranged the photographs of Charter 402, Blackwood's annotated analysis, Miss Ashton's teaching forgery, and Gervais's published reproduction, in chronological sequence. The narrative of deception lay bare upon the table in black and white progression, a visual indictment. "The person we want," Whimsy continued, "is not the one most obviously threatened, but the one who understood how all these individual terrors could be made to collide. Consider, who knew of Blackwood's embezzlement, Gervais's forgery, and Miss Ashton's pedagogical experiments? Who had access to official stationery, college watches, bell, mechanisms, and the private timetable of every person involved?" "The bursar," Parker suggested reluctantly. "He held the master keys, the financial records, the spare watches, knew about Blackwood's withdrawals." "Tempting," Whimsy conceded, "but no. The bursar lacks one essential qualification: imaginative malice. His sins are of omission rather than commission. No, Charles, we require someone trained in the precise manipulation of narrative, accustomed to reconstructing motives from fragmentary evidence. Someone for whom staging an alibi is little more than an exercise in applied historiography." Parker's expression altered. "You think the historian of methods, rather than events, is our culprit?" "Precisely. A scholar whose work concerns not the Middle Ages themselves, but how we interpret them. One who understands that changing the perceived order of events is as effective as altering the events themselves." He moved to the door and closed it quietly, leaving only a narrow gap. "Now, if you will indulge me, I propose to conduct a modest experiment in human behavior. We shall leave the scriptorium apparently unattended, the photographs carefully arranged, and allow news to circulate, quite inaccurately, that we have already established the exact time of death through chemical analysis." Parker stared. "But we haven't." "Naturally not, but the murderer doesn't know that. They possess one critical piece of private knowledge: that Blackwood died earlier than planned, around 6:45, when the bells should not yet have been ringing. If they visit this room tonight, it will be to confirm whether that knowledge remains their personal advantage, or whether the investigation has caught up." "And you propose we simply wait?" "Not quite. We shall wait in the cloister, where the acoustics are so conveniently treacherous. If you listen carefully, Charles, you will discover that murderers, like undergraduates, rarely move in perfect silence when they believe themselves unobserved." They withdrew, locking the scriptorium door with the incriminating key and returning it to Blackwood's usual pocket in his now vacant rooms, Whimsy insisting on this last detail, with almost pedantic pleasure. Then they took up their position in the shadowed east cloister, that same chill corridor where Blackwood had met his end. The college gradually subsided into its nocturnal rhythms, distant laughter from hall, the clink of cutlery, the solemn murmur of grace, then the slow extinction of lights. The stones grew colder beneath their feet. At last, somewhere between Compline and the small academic hours, a faint scrape sounded from the direction of the Fellows' garden gate. Whimsy's hand tightened on Parker's arm. "There," he whispered, voice scarcely more than breath. "Observe, Charles, our historian of the possible come to revise the record." Morning light filtered into the senior common room with that particular pallor which suggests that even the sun harbored grave reservations about academic gatherings. The remaining members of the Historical Society were assembled with the nervous formality of candidates awaiting viva voce examination. Miss Ashton sat very straight, her expression disciplined into professional neutrality. Gervase looked hollow-eyed. Fortescue seemed only marginally prevented from bolting. The bursar toyed with his watch chain like a man who mistrusts time itself. Parker occupied a discreet position by the door. Whimsy, lounging by the hearth, regarded them with the air of a don about to deliver a particularly brutal commentary on a poorly argued thesis. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began pleasantly, "we are gathered to discuss not medieval land grants, but the more immediate question of who rearranged Dr. Maillard." Blackwood's head with such regrettable finality. The method, as you know, was simple, the psychology less so. He paced once along the hearthrug. "We begin with Blackwood's blackmail. A man of his temperament could not resist exploiting weakness. Mr. Gervase's forged charter, conveniently, one of Miss Ashton's own pedagogical forgeries, gave him leverage. Mr. Fortescue's examination irregularity added a second string to his vindictive bow, and his embezzlement from college funds provided the necessary background of moral delinquency." Gervase flinched. Fortescue stared at the carpet. Miss Ashton's expression did not alter. "So far," Whimsy continued, "we might believe Blackwood the prime mover. But consider, who exposed Gervase's fraud through spectral analysis? Who prepared the photographic plates in the scriptorium? Not Blackwood. He could barely work a telephone. Without clerical support. Yet the work shows professional competence in document authentication, chemical handling, and optical technique." He turned, monocle glinting. "In short, it shows Miss Ashton's hand." She inclined her head slightly. "I assisted him. He demanded my expertise as the price of his silence." "It was coercion, not collaboration." "Undoubtedly," Whimsy agreed. "But coercion with a very particular side effect. It gave you intimate knowledge of who was being blackmailed, on what grounds, and with what evidence. You alone knew that when Blackwood confessed, he could drag down Gervase the bursar and yourself in one magnificent moral collapse." The bursar made a strangled noise. Whimsy silenced him with a glance. Next, the bells. Someone had the sacristan ill and young Fortescue deputized, someone with ready access to chapel and tower. The rope was subtly weakened with beeswax, designed to break at the first pull for morning prayer. That same someone closed the chapel doors, changing the cloister's acoustic profile from echo chamber to stone vault. When the blow fell, no bell rang and no cry carried. Parker spoke quietly. "Trevelyan confirms Miss Ashton had been helping with inventory in the bell tower these past weeks." Whimsy nodded. "Quite. Then there is time. Notes on college paper summoned Fortescue to the cloisters at 7, Gervase to the scriptorium at 6:30, Miss Ashton herself at 6:15. All in Blackwood's ostensible hand, yet all containing a neat grammatical solecism. In camera caritatis for in camera caritate. Blackwood would never have made it. Miss Ashton, whose Latin has been long subordinated to chemistry and optics, might." Her lips tightened. "You construct much upon a minor slip, Lord Peter." "Not alone upon it. The college watch issued to Gervase, reported stolen, reappears theatrically in Blackwood's dead hand, stopped at 6:45. But medical evidence puts death nearer 7:30. Only someone comfortable with apparatus would think to stop it, setting up a false time of death to incriminate Gervase." He fixed her with a level gaze. "Then there is the key, fresh-oiled in a gate rusted solid, and the acid etching the scriptorium lock. The same hand that plays with reagents in a dark room plays equally well with iron. The room held its breath. Whimsy's voice dropped.
You went to the scriptorium last night, Miss Ashton. Not for a stroll by the river.
You saw the evidence Blackwood had gathered, realized he meant to sacrifice you all on the altar of his late blooming conscience, and decided that if a reputation must be destroyed, better his than yours. He gestured almost gently. This morning you intercepted him en route to chapel, summoned earlier than his appointments expected. In the cloister, with doors closed and bells sabotaged, you struck him from behind with the nearest suitable weight, a decorative stone grotesque from the window ledge, now
Conspicuously absent.
You placed the stopped watch between his fingers, the key in his hand, and retired by the garden gate to the scriptorium, where you watched the college awaken to murder. Silence, thick as dust in a neglected library. Gervase half rose. Fortescue stared at Miss Ashton with dawning horror. She spoke at last, very calmly. You forget motive, Lord Peter. Why should I risk the gallows for such men as Blackwood and Gervase? Whimsy's tone was almost weary, because Blackwood would have ruined your life's work by painting you as a female Iago of the libraries, because no committee would ever quite believe the woman who forged the charter for teaching had not forged it for malice, because you knew that one allegation from one revered male scholar would set you back 30 years in 5 minutes, and because, his voice softened, you were very, very tired of having your achievements treated as a useful adjunct to other people's careers. For the first time, her composure cracked. He laughed, she said in a low, unsteady voice. When I begged him not to publish the accusation, he laughed, said it would be a moral lesson in female ambition. Parker stepped forward. Miss Ashton, I must warn you. She rose, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled only slightly. There is no need, Inspector. Lord Peter has conducted his seminar with regrettable clarity. She looked around the room, not pleading, merely taking inventory. Dr. Blackwood corrupted scholarship, corrupted men, and weaponized truth. I merely corrected the record.
Then, almost with academic precision, I shall make a full statement, but I will not repent exposing a monster, even if I chose an unsanctioned method.
Whimsy bowed slightly, something like respect in the gesture. The Church and the Crown may differ with you on methodology, Miss Ashton.
But the record, at least, will be accurate. Parker moved to her side, the formalities beginning.
Outside, the college bell struck the quarter hour with relentless, indifferent regularity. Time, Whimsy murmured, half to himself, does have a way of asserting its proper sequence in the end. The days that followed settled over St. Bartholomew's with that peculiar mixture of relief and distaste which academic institutions reserve for scandals that are at once disreputable and intellectually interesting. The college authorities, having briefly flirted with the dizzying prospect of national notoriety, hastened to restore the appearance of respectable obscurity with all the fervour of a repentant sinner returning to the 39 Articles. Inspector Parker departed with his prisoner and his paperwork, leaving behind the faint aroma of officialdom and a sheaf of unsigned statements. The fellows resumed their accustomed positions at high table, though conversation at dinner now circled warily around such innocuous topics as translation controversies and the humidity levels required for safe vellum storage. Nobody mentioned Blackwood by name if it could possibly be avoided. When it could not, he was referred to with the discreet impersonality customarily reserved for unfortunate medical conditions. Lord Peter lingered for 2 more days on the pretext of consulting the Bodleian's Aquinas manuscript, though in truth he appeared more interested in the sociology of academic recovery. On the second afternoon he encountered Gervase in the Fellows' Garden, standing by the now legitimate open gate with the expression of a man contemplating his own footnote in a particularly damning appendix. I hear, Whimsy remarked, lighting a cigarette with the air of offering small civilities to a condemned fortress, that the college has decided not to press charges over your documentary improvisations, provided you withdraw your monograph and resign your fellowship before the end of term." Gervase gave a short, mirthless laugh. "A gentlemanly academic suicide rather than public hanging. Very decent of them. Your evidence against Miss Ashton seems to have made my sins appear almost venial by comparison." "Comparative theology is always encouraging," Whimsy observed, "though I suspect the decision owed as much to the bursar's reluctance to see the college's financial linen washed in open court. Blackwood's embezzlement will be quietly written off as irregular accounting due to ill health, I fancy." Gervase stared at the worn flagstones. "She saved me, in a way. Miss Ashton. Had she not chosen the more spectacular crime, my forgery would have been the main scandal. I suppose I ought to feel grateful in between contemplating ruin." "It would be consistent with the facts," Whimsy replied. "She may even have told herself so in those preliminary stages when one dresses murder up as ethical necessity. It's always more comfortable to believe one is sacrificing a monster to save a victim than simply committing homicide with academic footnotes." He watched a rook descend upon the lawn with bureaucratic deliberation. "What will you do now?" "Go down, of course," Gervase said dully. "Disappear into some provincial grammar school if I'm lucky. Perhaps translate medieval sermons on repentance for private edification." "An occupation not without topical charm," Whimsy murmured. "Take my advice, and cultivate an almost neurotic exactitude about your references. Redemption in academia, as in theology, is largely a matter of reliable annotation." He left Gervase to his meditations and made his way toward the east cloister, where the stones still bore faint discolorations that the college cleaners, with proper Anglican delicacy, had elected not to pursue too vigorously. Fortescue intercepted him beneath the arches, looking marginally less cadaverous than on the morning of Blackwood's discovery. "They've cleared me entirely, Lord Peter," he blurted out. "The Dean says my scholarship will stand. I don't know how to thank you. By passing your exams without recourse to creative interpretation of source material," Whimsy suggested blandly, "and by avoiding private interviews in Gothic corridors with gentlemen of malicious disposition. Both are bad for the nerves." Fortescue flushed.
"Do you think she was entirely wicked, Miss Ashton, I mean?" "Wicked?" Whimsy considered. "No, that would be far too simple and worse, unliterary. She was intelligent, embittered, and tired of watching mediocrities promoted over her head. Blackwood gave her both the provocation and the mechanism. She supplied the moral rationalization and the technique. Between them, they constructed something very like one of those medieval morality plays, only with the parts miscast and the curtain brought down by the wrong character." He left the undergraduate with this unhelpful reflection and returned to the porter's lodge, where Hodges presented him with his bill and a faintly reproachful look, as though murder were an unbecoming extravagance for a guest. "College will be quieter when you're gone, my lord," the porter observed. "Not that it ain't grateful for what you've done." "My dear Hodges," Whimsy replied, tucking away the receipt, "colleges are like monasteries, designed for quiet but perpetually invaded by human nature. You may rely upon it that when this particular disturbance has sunk decently into tradition, another will arise to keep the stonework from growing complacent. It is, if I may say so, the one truly reliable principle of historical continuity." That evening he took the late train to London, leaving behind towers that rose nobly above gossip and cloisters that whispered with newly minted legend. As the college lamps receded into the mist, Whimsy opened a slim volume of Dante from his case and murmured, with dry appreciation not entirely devoid of pity, "La dirita via Erasmarita."
The straight road, he reflected, was all very well in theory, but mankind, particularly when provided with architecture, archives and opportunity, would insist upon taking the interesting detours. The London train had settled into that comfortable rhythm which encourages both digestion and reflection. Whimsy, having disposed of a modest luncheon and an immodest quantity of coffee, lounged in the corner of the first-class compartment with the languid grace of a man who has earned his indolence. Parker, opposite, toyed with his cigarette case in that faintly accusatory manner which suggests unfinished business. "There is one point," he began, "which still bothers me. Not about the murder, that's clear enough, but about you. You said in front of the entire common room that Miss Ashton had been feeding Blackwood material for his blackmail, but you had no written proof of those anonymous letters. You only knew she supplied them after she confessed. How did you come to suspect her in the first place?" Whimsy regarded the passing landscape with exaggerated interest. "My dear Charles, if I were to answer that question too explicitly, you would no longer feel the faint, flattering sense that I am indispensable. That would be disastrous for our professional relationship." "Peter," Whimsy smiled, relenting. "Very well, consider the pattern. Blackwood's victims, Gervase, Fortescue, Miss Ashton herself, were all connected by one feature. Each had committed a different sort of academic offence.
Forgery, cheating, professional manipulation. Blackwood lacked either the subtlety or the technical competence to discover all those sins unaided.
But Miss Ashton possessed both, and more importantly, the moral rigour to find such offences intolerable." "But moral rigour doesn't generally lead to murder?" "No, it leads to an obsession with correction." Whimsy drew an idle figure on the fogged window. "Your ordinary blackmailer extracts money and leaves the original sin untouched. He merely feeds upon it. Miss Ashton wanted to rewrite the situation itself. Remove Blackwood. Remove the forged charter. Remove the examination irregularities. Clean the slate. It was the mindset of an editor, not a parasite." Parker considered this. "You thought she would rather destroy the whole edifice than allow a false version of the past to persist." "Exactly. And she chose her instruments with editorial elegance. She didn't introduce foreign elements, poison from outside, stranger from London. She took what was already present in the text: Blackwood's malice, Gervase's forgery, Fortescue's weakness, the college's failing clocks. She merely rearranged them into a more decisive conclusion." "You make her sound almost admirable," Parker observed dryly. "In intellectual terms, she was formidable," Whimsy replied. "Morally, well, there she fell into the oldest scholarly trap of all, mistaking intellectual superiority for entitlement to judgment. Once a person believes they alone read the text correctly, it is a very short step to amending the manuscript with a dagger." Parker lit a cigarette, exhaling thoughtfully.
"You were rather gentle with Gervase and the boy." "One must be," Whimsy replied. "The world will do the rest."
"Gervase will live out his days under a perpetual suspicion that his footnotes aren't to be trusted. Fortescue will never again sit an examination without hearing those bells. Call it a lighter penance than rope, but penance nonetheless." He reached into his pocket and drew out the now innocuous college watch, restored to working order, its hands ticking with restored decorum. "I took the liberty of having this repaired before we left," he said. "Curious thing about time, Charles. It will be falsified for a while, but in the end it insists on going on correctly. One can only deceive it by stopping it altogether, and that is called murder. Our Miss Ashton understood that perfectly. She simply chose the wrong clock to stop." Parker watched the watch face a moment, then smiled faintly. "You're feeling philosophical today?" "Oxford always has that effect," Whimsy replied. "All those towers and cloisters, pretending that knowledge elevates character, whereas, as we have just observed, it merely sharpens whatever instrument is already in the hand, be it scalpel, pen, or silver salver." The train roared briefly through a tunnel, plunging the compartment into reflected darkness. When the light returned, Whimsy slipped the watch back into his pocket with finality. "Well, Charles, I fancy that's enough medieval morality for 1 week. Once we arrive, I shall take Bunter to the theatre and observe some less lethal forms of make-believe. The human passion for illusion when confined to the stage is positively edifying. And if the yard requires you for something less edifying..." Whimsy gave a small, apologetic shrug. Then I shall sigh, put away my Aquinas and my programme, and come and look at your next corpse, provided, of course, that it shows a proper respect for chronology. The train pressed on toward London, leaving behind college bells now ringing with punctilious correctness, and a cloister that would whisper for many years of the scholar who had tried to edit human life as ruthlessly as a corrupt manuscript, and had been, like all forgers of history, at last corrected in her turn.